people doubt that NATO, rather than being a force for peace, as some people claim, is really just a dangerous, nuclear-armed, unaccountable force for war. So tonight, here to discuss both the summit and more besides, we have a panel of international and national speakers. And I'm sure they're all going to share their insights on what happened at the summit and how the recent elections, and both here in France and in the European Union, as well as the forthcoming election in the States, is going to impact on NATO. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, who is Vijay Prashad. He's zooming in all the way from Shanghai. So please bear with him if the internet goes a bit funny, but I gather everything there works very well, unlike here in the UK. Vijay is, I'm sure as many of you know, a renowned historian, a journalist, and an author of many, many books. And he's also the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. So Vijay, over to you.
Thanks a lot. It's really great to be with you, and I'm very grateful to Stop the War and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament for having me. The first time I'm doing anything with anybody from the United Kingdom since you had your big election, where Mr. Keir Starmer, with 1/3 of the vote, was able to secure 60% of the seats in Westminster. Congratulations for that lopsided democracy that you have. But there it is. That's what you have. I know some of you are grateful that Rishi Sunak has departed from number 10. But my goodness, if you're happy to see Keir Starmer in there, I'm not sure what you're doing in this meeting. But that's for you to say, not for me. Yes, indeed. I'm sitting in Shanghai in the People's Republic of China, and it's from here that I watched what was happening at the North Atlantic Treaty Organization Summit held in Washington, D.C. Now, of course, the United States is a country. It's a circus. Not sure what is what, really, a country or a circus. There are real people living there, but watching things happening in the United States on the television is always terrifying. I watched a little bit of Mr. Trump parading himself into the Republican National Convention with his ear bandaged and so on. A curious country. If it claims to be the leader of the world, what are we doing on the planet Earth, really? Not sure. Terrifying prospect. Well, at the NATO meeting in Washington, they replaced the Secretary General, was Jens Stoltenberg, a rather mediocre politician who made for a pretty mediocre leader of NATO. But then, sincerely, since 1949, NATO leaders have been picked for their mediocrity in order that NATO is actually run by the people who run it, which is the US generals and the Pentagon. You don't really want a strong European leader running or riding a Trojan horse. You want somebody weak like Jens Stoltenberg. He was replaced by Mark Rutte of the Netherlands. Interesting character, Mr. Rutte. Has been off and on the Prime Minister of the Netherlands since 2010, stepped down from the post recently. Mr. Rutte is an interesting person, but also dangerous. In May of this year, he authorized Ukraine to use Dutch fighter jets and to use them to fly into Russian territory and bomb Russian targets. Now imagine, Netherlands, a NATO member, is saying that it would allow its firepower to be used by the Ukrainians to directly attack Russian territory. An incredible provocation, which if the fighter jet was shot down and if it happened to have a Dutch fighter pilot on board, could trigger Article 5 of the NATO Charter and bring the NATO countries all in total to war against Russia. Reckless, in fact. And that is the man that is now going to be running NATO for the next period, Mr. Mark Rutte. you might want to get used to his name. Now, at this Washington meeting, of course, there was a declaration. I'm not sure how many of you have taken the time to read the declaration. It's hard to read these things. Classically, it's filled with obfuscations and evasions. But there's one part of the declaration that struck me as important to point out. Before I get to the declaration, Mr. Jens Stoltenberg, in his final NATO summit as the Secretary General, gave a press conference. Now, at the press conference, Stoltenberg said something quite interesting, and I want to actually point it out. At the press conference, he talked about the 4 partners that NATO has in what the United States calls the Indo-Pacific. And in this section, it talks about the fact that security is global, not regional. Now, I'm sympathetic to this idea. Security is indeed global, not necessarily regional. What he means by that, and he says it pretty explicitly, is that NATO, with these 4 so-called Indo-Pacific partners, must play a role in the new Cold War against China. Interesting, because when you look at the Washington Declaration, which Stoltenberg also quotes at this press conference, the NATO countries go after China. For what reason? I mean, after all, none of the NATO countries border China. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. China is not in the North Atlantic. China is indeed a country with a waterfront on an ocean, but not the Atlantic. It's the Pacific. So what does NATO have to say about China? Well, interesting, actually. They tried to drag China into their particular orbit by saying or accusing China of being a decisive enabler. That's the phrase they use. Get used to this phrase. You're going to hear it a lot. If Joe Biden is able to remember it, you might hear it from him, but you'll certainly hear it from Antony Blinken and other mediocrities who participate in Mr. Biden's cabinet. Decisive enabler. What do they mean by decisive enabler? They're making an argument that the war that is taking place in Ukraine after Russia invaded Ukraine 2 years ago, that war is being enabled by China. This is bizarre. China is not funding this war. In fact, quite the opposite. I just mentioned that Mark Rutte, as Prime Minister of the Netherlands, encouraged Ukraine to use Dutch-provided jets to bomb inside Russia. There are no Chinese fighter jets being used by the Russian, no Chinese war material. Indeed, there is something that is interesting, which is that China and Russia signed a so-called no limits partnership. But China is not providing material for this war. It's not underwriting the war. It is NATO that is in fact providing material through its member states to Ukraine. And it's NATO that is in fact pushing Ukraine to continue this war and not bring it to a close. But NATO Council cleverly used the idea of decisive enabler to make itself relevant in the Pacific. And then for Mark Rutte to talk about the collaboration with the Indo-Pacific partners against China. This is a very interesting set of statements, and it's also chilling because it looks like rather than back off from this new Cold War in Asia against China, NATO countries, the most lethal military force in the world, NATO states plus their few allies in the so-called Indo-Pacific, are responsible for 75% of world military spending. China is responsible for 10% of world military spending. 75% of world, very dangerous political and military organization is NATO. NATO is trying to push itself even now into the Pacific Ocean where it doesn't belong. Its charter doesn't say anything about the Pacific. It says something about out of area operations.
Oh, Vijay, you've been muted.
Yes,
but
I see.
Got 1 minute left.
Yes, interesting. Um, it says something about out of area operations, nothing about the Pacific. You might want to have somebody in Europe sue NATO for, in fact, exceeding its treaty mandate. Might be an interesting thing, Kate or Lindsay. Could be interesting for somebody to open a lawsuit to say NATO is violating its treaty obligations, which say security for the Atlantic, not security for the Pacific. Nobody wants NATO in the Pacific. We don't want NATO in the Pacific. We want NATO to go home. Or better yet, we might ask you to consider that perhaps NATO needs to be shut down. It is a dangerous organization. In the Pacific region, China is the largest trading partner of most of the countries here, including the largest trading partner of the AUKUS partners, Australia and New Zealand. I'd just like to point out that recently the US Federal Reserve released a statement, and the last line of the statement is the following. All told, a delinking of global production processes and consumption from China is not in sight. In other words, it is very clear from the US Federal Reserve that there is going to be no delinking from China for the West. There's not going to be economic delinking. Might want to consider dialing down the temperature a little bit, dialing down the temperature of war a little bit. We want to live in a planet of peace, not in a planet of war. Take that message to Mark Rutte, please, as Stop the War and campaign for nuclear disarmament. Thanks a lot.
Thanks. And key figure in the anti-war movement, both here in the UK and internationally. Kate, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tarina. Hello, everybody, and thanks for sticking with us in difficult circumstances. So I think the title of the meeting this evening, it really sums up what the situation is. This is NATO's war summit. It's about nothing but war. But of course, the other part of the title is what the challenge is for us. How do we stop the spread of war? And that is absolutely crucial, because I would say, I'm sure most of us would agree perhaps, that the NATO summit has brought a wider war, potentially a nuclear war, potentially World War III, quite a bit closer. And I think it was Vijay who said, do read the statement. And it's well worth reading, because although there is the obfuscation that he talked about, nevertheless, you do get to see the itemized activities and priorities and so on, which NATO has. And knowing those, I think, arms us as well. So of the many terrible outcomes that you can see there, I'd like to focus on just a few. I think there are two that are particularly provocative in a kind of an immediate sense. The first is the decision, which I'm sure Sevim Dagdalen will mention later on, which is the sending of US long-range missiles to Germany for the first time since the Cold War. They're supposedly on a kind of temporary basis, but it's believed that they will eventually become permanent. That's the first time since the Cold War. And Germany, France, Italy, and Poland have agreed to develop a European long-range missile. And this is another factor of everything that's going on now, an intensive militarization and remilitarization of Europe on the scale that we haven't seen for decades. And I think it's true to say that really there's an arms race, a new arms race is upon us. And then the second is the reinforcement of Stoltenberg's assertion that Ukraine's right of self-defense includes striking targets within Russia, and weapons are going to Ukraine from NATO countries to enable that to take place. Now, previously, of course, you may remember that President Biden said he wasn't going to allow that because that was a fast route to World War III. Well, now he's changed his mind. Maybe he's prepared to countenance World War III. But that is a very dangerous development. So within the statement, there is quite a lot about the massive militarization of Europe, and in particular, the driving of public finances to that end. And of course, we've seen that development here in Britain, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So in terms of the militarization, the increasing militarization, one of the aspects of this is enhancing air and missile defense, including NATO's so-called ballistic missile defense systems. They're not really defense systems, they're part of attack systems. C&D's been campaigning against this since the end of the last century, so it's something that hasn't gone away. But we now have many of these systems, kind of mobile systems on ships, but now a new onshore site has been established in Poland, so adding to those in Spain, Romania and Turkey. So there are so many different levels of militarization taking place. Okay. Anyone like to remove that person? Then we have a further commitment to the modernizing of nuclear capabilities, so NATO's nuclear capabilities. This has already been happening across Europe. Many of you will know that the NATO nuclear bases across Europe are being prepared to receive the new B6112 bombs. These are very much upgraded nuclear bombs, and they are also coming to Lakenheath in Britain. So you probably know US nuclear weapons coming back to Lakenheath in East Anglia. And on a positive note, yesterday, a peace camp was set up there at RAF Lakenheath to protest against those nuclear weapons coming back. So there's bad things, but there are also some very positive things happening too. And then last month, this is also on the nuclear front, Stoltenberg said that NATO was increasing its operationally available warheads. So in this kind of whole militarization, whole building up to war, there is this kind of very, very strong nuclear thread within that. In terms of the spending, 2/3 of NATO members now spend at least 2%. So that's a massive, very rapid increase. Spending amongst the Canada and European members, that's up by 18% in 2024 alone. So it's massive. It's just absolutely extraordinarily dreadful. I won't touch on the Russia-China relationship aspects because Vijay's covered those. But just to say one other aspect of the NATO stuff, which is very significant, I think, a huge amount about strengthening so-called defense industries. Okay, so it's not just talking about the weapons and all that. It's a really big policy statement about strengthening defense industries. So bringing this kind of home to Britain, apologies to international people, but today, of course, you may have seen that the government announced the framework for its strategic defence review. This is kind of to look at the whole package of Britain's military stuff, its nuclear stuff, everything to do with that. And what's really struck me, having read the NATO statement, was how a lot of it is a kind of mini version of the NATO statement itself, of the outcomes of the NATO summit. So first of all, the defence sector, the UK defence sector, will be a big cornerstone of the government's new industrial strategy. So really driving towards that defence sort of military production. And apparently they say they want to make the MOD an economic department that drives growth, wealth creation and prosperity. I mean, it's just pretty much unbelievable. Anyway, that's what they want to do. A lot of work for us to do today. Of course, the commitment to 2.5% of GDP going on the military, and part of the kind of motivation behind the Strategic Defence Review is that they'll work out, whether they should do that, where they're going to get the extra 3% from, and all that. So that's the claim there. Now, the interesting thing, and army recruitment as well. So the particularly interesting thing I thought was who is in charge of this defence review. Well, Healy, the Defence Secretary, he's kind of overall supremo, but the three people who've been named are the kind of senior person, Lord Robertson. Remember Robertson, who was the, can't remember his first name, Angus Robertson. No, not Angus Robertson. What's his first name, Lord Robertson? Anyway, he was an MP. He was George Robertson. Thank you very much. Yeah, he was a Labour MP, and then he became Secretary General of NATO, and prior to Stoltenberg. So, you know, that's his track record. He was also responsible for the last Labour security review under Blair. So he's been brought back by Keir Starmer to kind of set out the strategic defence review. He's got two particular named advisors, no doubt there'll be loads of others, but Fiona Hill, remember that name? She was a former Trump advisor. She went a bit off-piste because I think she backed him being impeached, so she's in bad odour with him. But nevertheless, she was his advisor in the first place. Not good. And
One
then,
minute left, Kate.
Okay, thanks. And then General Sir Richard Barrons, who is a British four-star general. You know, so anyway, that's the situation there. So the other thing I would just throw in really is that this really the defence review stuff, you know, the kind of stuff coming out around it really ramps up the rhetoric over the previous government's phraseology. You know, if we thought the Tories were bad on this, the terms and the phrases used by the Labour government are much more antagonistic, much more aggressive in the way they talk about other global states and so on. So it's not good. So our work is more important than ever, friends, obviously. The thing that strikes me particularly, apart from the importance of building the movement, the kind of activities that that Andrew has referred to, really, because of the whole focus on the defence sector, I think we have to have a really enormous turn to the trade union movement. You know, we know that some trade unions support this kind of argumentation about, you know, build the defence sector, it's really good and it's great and all that kind of thing. We have to have our arguments. We have to be mobilising pro-peace people in the trade union movement. You know, that I think that's an absolutely fundamental aspect of our work, and I look forward to carrying that forward with as many of you as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Kate. Our next speaker this evening is David Swanson. David is an author, activist, journalist, radio host, as well as the co-founder and executive director of the World Beyond War, which is, for those who don't know, a very much a grassroots organisation based in the US that campaigns against all wars. So, David, over to you.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be here with all of you terrific people. Also co-author with the wonderful Medea Benjamin of a new book about NATO. After somebody shot Donald Trump, Joe Biden said indignantly, "We resolve our differences at the ballot," which is classic propaganda, taking something obviously true, namely it's evil to shoot people, and using it to make seem true something obviously false, namely you can use a ballot in a US election to choose policies you support and have them enacted. When Trump and Biden debated, they debated who would destroy Gaza faster and who would make Europe move more money into war. No election ballot in the United States will resolve any war. And of course, when Biden says he is running the world, at least 96% of the world doesn't get any say in that on any ballot. Here's another bit of Biden propaganda. See if you can spot any problems with it. We support NATO in order to work together with the world. Spot anything? If you spotted the fact that there are ways to work with the world other than mass murder, or the fact that NATO is only part of the world and is heartily despised by most of the world in polling, or the fact that NATO decisions are mostly made by the US government and not by all of its members or all of its members and partners, or the fact that the United Nations, deeply flawed as it is, exists, and that the most serious, long-standing violation of its charter is the existence of NATO as a gang that drags nations into participation in wars, then you win the prize. The prize is getting to go explain things to other people. Here's another bit of democraganda. We stand with NATO, not with Trump. Do you notice anything wrong with that one? Personally, I have no trouble denouncing both NATO and Trump. If Trump opposed NATO, I wouldn't support NATO. I didn't oppose campaign violence 8 years ago because Trump was telling rallies to drag protesters out and beat them. And I don't support election violence now that Trump opposes it. But does Trump oppose NATO? The fact is that Biden's great accomplishment of getting Europe to take more money out of schools and hospitals and dump it into weapons was done more by Trump than by Biden. Nobody likes to notice this, but Trump's buy more weapons or I'll tell Russia to attack you worked better on the heroic leaders of the free world than did Biden's buy more weapons or I'll mumble incoherently. The US Congress actually passed legislation to prevent Trump from leaving NATO. But the point was not to prevent Trump leaving NATO. The point was to teach us that leaving NATO is something that only a fascistic buffoon who has people at his rallies beaten would do, and to reinforce the lesson already internalized by millions that Trump is a servant of the Dark Lord Vladimir, or I'm sorry, he who shall not be named. In reality, of course, Trump and Biden are servants of weapons dealers and very good ones. As a servant of Russia, Trump was not very good. He sent weapons to Ukraine that Obama wouldn't, evicted Russian diplomats, sanctioned Russian officials, put missiles practically on Russia's border, lobbied European nations to drop Russian energy deals, left the Iran agreement, tore up the INF treaty, rejected Russia's offers on banning weapons in space or cyber war, expanded NATO eastward, added a NATO partner in Colombia, proposed adding Brazil, splurged on more nukes, bombed Russians in Syria, oversaw the largest war rehearsals in Europe in half a century, now outdone, and condemned all proposals for a non-NATO European military, insisting that Europe stick with NATO. While NATO is thought of as an alliance of existing militaries, it expends much of its energy on the NATO Support and Procurement Agency, which lines up weapons deals between manufacturers and governments. The NATO Support and Procurement Agency is headquartered in Luxembourg with operational centers in France, Hungary, and Italy. It has a greater number of staff and handles greater amounts of money than does NATO itself. According to NATO's 2023 annual report, NATO's international staff had 1,352 civilians, but the NATO Support and Procurement Agency employed more than 1,400 international civilian personnel. And in 2023, the value of the agency's business activity exceeded 5 billion euros, which is greater than NATO's total budget. NATO also raises money from its partners to spend on weapons. In January of this year, the Prime Minister of Japan committed $37 million to NATO for buying weapons for Ukraine. NATO's main purpose now is increasing weapons spending while trying not to increase non-US weapons manufacturing too much. Here is something else Biden says. We support NATO, not surrender to Putin. Of course, the thought that you could oppose NATO and oppose surrendering to anybody occasionally enters a few heads. And the thought that you could do something else with Putin, such as speak with him, enters many more. At his only press conference this year, last week, Biden was obliged to say, I see no point in speaking with Putin. Well, people who want life on Earth to survive see a point in it. We are closer to nuclear war than we've ever been, and we know better than we've ever known that there is no such thing as a limited nuclear war. that NATO is the world's leading nuclear war planner gets lost in NATO's unofficial name. I have been at fault, perhaps, in simply calling it NATO. In the US media, its name is usually the Defensive Alliance, NATO. As with calling the most openly provoked war in living memory the unprovoked war on Ukraine, you can be sure of one thing right away. NATO is not a defensive alliance. In fact, not a single NATO war has ever even pretended to be defending a NATO member against a foreign invasion. Only once has NATO even claimed to be calling all of its members into a war, the US war of revenge, punishing the people of Afghanistan who had mostly never heard of the crimes of September 11th for the crimes of September 11th. Every other NATO war has lacked even the US coerced consensus of NATO members, as well as even any pretense of defensiveness. Here is another word that, if used properly, can mean nothing whatsoever. What Orwell might have called pure wind. The word is irreversible. Sadly, as far as I know, dementia is irreversible. Climate collapse is irreversible, unless we learn otherwise. But announcing that the process of Ukraine joining NATO is irreversible isn't even false. It's meaningless. It's a means of neither making Ukraine a NATO member nor refusing to make Ukraine a NATO member, and yet vocalizing certain sounds that resemble human speech. Sometimes the propagandists start believing their own lies. But for the most part, political speech and even political action is a show put on by the rulers for the ruled. There were times during the early decades of the Cold War when Soviet or US militarists timed incidents to boost the other side's efforts at increasing military spending. Such symbiotic relations need not be discussed or even thought. But when the day before NATO holds a conference, Russia sends missiles into Kyiv and Belarus threatens to nuke somebody and China has troops doing war drills in Europe, the weapons dealers and their corrupt government lackeys who thrive on conflict and hatred benefit, and everybody else doesn't. When government officials obey NATO rather than the people of their nations in shaping their budgets, the world is worse off. When the US blows up your pipeline or puts nukes into your country and your champions of democracy bend over and shout, "Thank you, sir, may I have another?" Hope for humanity dies a little bit. Friends do not let friends use their names to provide NATO's pseudo-legitimacy for wars. When people from around the world working together without NATO recently met in Washington, D.C. for a counter summit and rally, we met as citizens of the world, united in opposition to the normalization of mass killing. You can see everything that we did at nonatoyespeace.org. Next June, we will be doing the same, but more of it, and we will bring indictments with us because NATO will be conveniently gathering in The Hague. I look forward to seeing every one of you there. Thank you.
Perfectly timed, David. Thank you very much for that. So our next speaker is Sevim Dagdalen. She has been a member of the German Parliament since 2005 and is an expert in German foreign policy. And Sevim has also written a book about NATO recently to mark the 75th anniversary called A Reckoning with the Atlantic Alliance. So Sevim, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Well, thanks for organizing this event with the title NATO's War Summit, How Do We Stop the Spread of War? I think, first of all, we have to analyze the situation. I mean, you all remember the Hungarian Prime Minister and President of the European Union Council, Viktor Orban, has traveled to Kiev, Moscow, Beijing, and then to Washington, and then even to Donald Trump to explore possibilities for a ceasefire in Ukraine, for a negotiated peace in Ukraine. And I think it's a good thing. despite the fact that I'm not agreeing on every political issue with Orban, but this is a good thing. And it is a shame for our point of view that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz or the German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock from the Greens prefer to stay at home rather than to have a dialogue with conflict parties. And I think it is criminal that the European Union Commission President Ursula von der Leyen now is ordering punitive measures for this peace diplomacy instead of supporting Orban in his efforts to bring about a political end to the war and the killing and the dying in Ukraine. And I want to remind you, I don't know if you just noticed it yesterday, German newspapers, they reported that according to a very recent survey poll in Ukraine, 44% of the population in Ukraine, they support negotiations with Russia. 44% of the population in Ukraine, just 1/3 is against negotiation. That means that the people in favor of negotiation in Ukraine, political negotiations with Russia are more, way more than the other ones. And Ursula von der Leyen, who refuses and sabotages peace, should not be given a second term in office now when she is going into her candidacy on Thursday. The NATO summit in Washington, David just mentioned, I was there as well at the counter summit of the peace movement of the United States and the rally in front of the White House. I think it's a historic summit. It was a historic summit because first the NATO head of states and governments, they deepened their strategy in the proxy war in Ukraine. They decided more weapons, more money for Ukraine, and that means less money for their own population. That means social war against their own populations in the NATO member states. The second is, in addition to this escalation in Ukraine, for the first time, NATO is positioning itself against China and decided the expansion into Asia. So the Washington summit was the starting signal for a global NATO by enforcing the US claims to global hegemony. NATO is running the risk of, by the way, of overstretching itself and attracting more and more opponents. The other point is that with giving the signal against China, the NATO summit in Washington threatens to set in train a Cuban missile crisis of truly global scale. Recall that in 1962, nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union was averted only at the last moment. So, and since that time, an unspoken diplomatic rule has held that countries in the close proximity of great powers should neither be bound by military pacts nor make their territories available to rival alliances. And it was precisely for this reason that US diplomats like George Kennan advised against NATO's eastward expansion in the 1990s, in part because they feared a potential backlash. So as we know, and history shows, he was not listened to. And today NATO is waging a proxy war in Ukraine against Russia with its own mission headquartered, Kate just mentioned it, in the German city of Wiesbaden. And with the stationing of new long-range US missiles in Germany, and they were just speaking about Tomahawks. Tomahawks have a reach out of 2,000 kilometers, but it's not only Tomahawks. The US is apparently planning to station the Dark Eagle II with a reach of 2,750 kilometers. So it's very clear that they are planning that these weapons should have a reach out till Moscow, for example, a very long distance. So, with the stationing of these new long-range US missiles in Germany, our country, Germany, is becoming a target for Russian reactions, of course. And the road leading to escalation, including direct military confrontation and the deployment of weapons of mass destruction, now appears to be well mapped. And the other thing is the real absurdity of this NATO summit in Washington last week was, however, is that a strategy aimed at Russia, which according to Cannon would guarantee direct military confrontation and increase the risk of world war dramatically, is now being really globalized and turned against China. Vijay mentioned it, that NATO is to become a global power formally, and at least from Beijing's perspective, aims to advance on China. And for the first time being, NATO will operate on the basis of bilateral treaties. That's why I think it's very unlikely to have a chance on a judicial level with a lawsuit regarding the NATO treaty, because they are not as formally as NATO in Asia, but in terms of bilateral treaties of the member states with Philippines, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan in the Pacific. But the goal appears to be an expansion, of course, of the military pact throughout the region so that it will exist as a North Atlantic alliance in name alone. And the US is betting alongside its NATO allies on threatening China, dreaming of a return to a colonial relationship where other countries can tell China what it should and should not. And that's why I do think we're living through a very dangerous moment in international politics as a result of that neo-colonialist illusion. And the idea is to ruin Russia in order to then take on China, in the hope of regaining the old, now fading hegemony. And this worldview ignores the developments of recent years. And I think this is the first main, really most important point of the international peace movement, that we have to be clear. What is the goal? What is the aim of the NATO led by the United States? If we are not clear in the analyze, then we cannot have a really proper strategy, and we cannot have a common sense how we can stop the spread of war, like the title of this webinar. And we in Germany, for example, as the Sarah Wagenknecht Alliance, we are calling for a referendum on the planned stationing of long-range US weapons for attacks on targets deep in Russia. We think a sane foreign policy is imperative now, perhaps more than ever. Even a return to a Kennedy or a Cannon would be an improvement. And the upcoming elections in the east of Germany in 3 state levels, we do have elections. We want to build these elections as a kind of referendum about this stationing of the long-range US weapons in Germany. And one thing,
you could wrap up.
Pardon?
If you could wrap up, we've got a minute left.
Yeah, wrap it up. So I think the first thing is we have to do the analyze very clear, and secondly, we have to inform the people and talk to the people. What is the analyze of this NATO summit? What are the aims of this NATO summit? What is the danger for the population, and what it means on the social level as well as the social war? And the third is to organize then the resistance to this war policies. But I think the most important is to have the analyze clear, because we are facing in Germany very disorientation, irritation within the peace movement first time ever first time ever, some parts of the German peace movement didn't do anything, didn't declare anything against the NATO summit. And I think this shows how problematic, how difficult it is to challenge the war policy if we are not clear in the analysis.
Thanks very much, Sevim. That's very interesting to hear what's going on in Germany. Okay, our last speaker this evening is Lindsay German. I'm sure most of you know Lindsay. She's the founding member and convener of Stop the War Coalition, a lifelong anti-war activist, writer, and campaigner. Over to you, Lindsay.
Okay, thanks very much, Tarina, and thanks to all the previous speakers. I think that the point that Sevim just made is that we're at a very, very dangerous point in world history, and the most dangerous, interestingly, George Robertson, that Kate referred to earlier, who's conducting this strategic review, said, because he was defense minister under Tony Blair, so more than 20 years ago, and he said now the situation is completely different. We have a much bigger threat from Russia. We have a much bigger threat from China. In fact, he talks about the deadly quartet, which is China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, which you might otherwise say is people we don't like very much. You know, there doesn't seem to be any particular reason why he's picked on those four, but there's no question now that we are facing a very dangerous situation in the United States and in Europe, where if you look at the result of the NATO summit, if you look at the whole thrust of the NATO summit, what does it amount to? It amounts to continuing to bolster the war in Ukraine with possibly very, very serious international consequences, with more long-range weapons going in and missiles going in, with the agreement now of the major powers that it's okay for Ukraine to fire missiles into Russian territory rather than just use them in Ukrainian territory. We've also had a commitment by all of these powers to increase arms spending, and this is at the cost of the populations of Europe and of the United States. We're told in this country with the new Labour government that they cannot lift the cap on child benefit, which at the moment sticks at 2 children, and yet Keir Starmer announced the other day that he is committing £3 billion a year on top of everything else that Britain already spends on funding Ukraine, on sending arms to Ukraine, and all the other amounts of money they have on they spend on arms. And then, of course, there's the question of the conflict, which is spreading. Not just, we have a serious major war going on in Ukraine, and one which is not being won by Ukraine, is not being won by NATO in the proxy war, and will not be won unless NATO directly intervenes in that battle with really horrific consequences, with NATO troops on the ground. There's also the major conflict in Gaza, which is barely referred to by these people, but which is a very, very serious issue. And of course, the whole question of rearming Germany, which is a major question, rearming Japan. By 2030, Japan will be the biggest arms spender in the world, the third biggest arms spender in the world after the United States and after China. Now, there is only one reason for this, and this is because of its geographical location in the Pacific, as in potential conflict with China. So these are very, very serious questions. There's also the question that now the European leaders who wanted Biden very much, the majority of them wanted Biden as the new US president. This is looking less and less likely, and they're coming to terms with Trump and JD Vance as the possible president and vice president. So again, you've got France, you've got Germany, you've got Britain talking more and more about European defense, about having to raise the level of spending, and all of these different things. And this is at a time when actually the point that I think it was Sevim made about the widespread minority opposition to the war in Ukraine and the call for a settlement, even in Britain, which is one of the most supportive of NATO's war in Ukraine. A quarter of people in opinion polls want a negotiated settlement and want to end the war. So this is never reflected in the media, it's never reflected in any of these ways, but this is a sizable minority and would only grow if you could have any kind of open discussion about these kind of things. So we now have a situation where war is absolutely centrally on the agenda. And in Britain, astonishingly, which hasn't had conscription since I think 1960, 1961, they're now talking about reintroducing some form of military conscription for young people. It's as if there is some immediate threat of war, which absolutely everybody knows there is no threat of direct invasion or direct attack on Britain from anywhere, including from Russia. In fact, if you look at Britain's role in the last few decades, of course, it has been the other way around: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and of course the support for Israel in Gaza. So you've got a dangerous situation, and I think a particularly dangerous situation in Britain, because you have a new Labour government, which is extremely right-wing, extremely authoritarian, which was elected, as Vijay said at the very beginning, on only just over a third of the popular vote, so has very little legitimacy, but has put itself firmly in the camp of militarism, in the camp of scapegoating refugees, in the camp of wanting more money on arms spending and of waving the flag at every possible opportunity, as Keir Starmer did in Washington. So you have this problem, this strategic review, which is conducted by George Robertson, and also helped by Fiona Hill, who, as Kate said, was an advisor to Trump before they fell out. This is the kind of direction which British politics is going in. And we had the collapse of the Tory party, which is the traditional party of the British ruling class, but the growth of the Reform Party, which is one reason that Labour was able to get a big landslide. And we've seen, unfortunately, from the meeting tonight, exactly the sort of politics involved in some of those, in some of that right-wing agenda. And it seems to me that therefore the peace movement not only has to campaign against the war in Ukraine, campaign against NATO, which, as in Germany, the Labour Party here is absolutely committed to NATO. In fact, it claims it was the founder of NATO and it wouldn't have happened without Britain. The Green Party now supports NATO, at least they claim it's only as a defensive alliance. But as everybody knows, NATO isn't a defensive alliance. It's an aggressive alliance. It's about conducting war. It's about the spread of war. It's about all those sorts of things. So even the liberal left, if you like, has abandoned any opposition to this kind of militarism, is going along with it. And you can see the potential for this to all go very, very badly in terms of politics. And I think it's also fair to say you can see that across lots of Europe, and many, if you look at opinion in Europe, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, there's a lot of opposition to the war in Ukraine. There's a lot of opposition to the idea of more wars for very obvious reasons, that people have suffered from wars greatly within living memory, and this is a very serious thing. But of course, the far right are managing to very often oppose the war in Ukraine and oppose other wars, and this gives them some sort of kudos that can allow them to grow. So this is a dangerous situation, and one that we have to look at. And I think it seems to me we have to do two or three things. We have to keep strengthening the Palestine movement, which is a huge movement in this country, and we have a protest. We're going to link hands around Parliament on Thursday. We've got another national demonstration on August the 3rd, and that has mobilized very large numbers of people. Although the way that this movement is treated, you would think that everybody in it was an extremist, terrorist, or any, a hate marcher and all these kind of things. But of course, it's exactly the opposite. But one of the challenges for us is to take the Palestine movement into the anti-NATO movement, to begin to link up the different issues. They are different issues. There are obviously all sorts of particular circumstances in each, but involved in both of them is Western imperialism and its role and importance in the particular region. So we have to look at that as well. And that means that we have to oppose the increase in defense spending, which Starmer wants to put up to 2.5% of GDP. This is something which is backed by a number of the unions, and it's a very serious retreat by the trade union movement in this country. And that's why I think it's very important to endorse the point that Kate made, that we have to move much more into the trade unions. We have model resolutions on Ukraine. We have to begin to turn the tide of this militarism and support for war and support for NATO. And that means much more activity inside the trade unions, but also much more presence on the streets. You know, there is a very great contrast with the way in which Palestine is treated and the way in which Ukraine is treated. You're allowed to debate Ukraine in schools. You're allowed to have the Ukrainian flag in schools. You're not allowed to do that with the Palestinians. And that means there is a constant right-wing pressure to support the Ukraine war without looking at what happens with Palestine and elsewhere. So it seems to me, I don't see you can talk about, particularly in Britain, which is, as people know, one of the oldest imperialist countries in the world, I don't see you can talk about Labour policy, about domestic policy, about what's happening to the NHS or schools or any of these things without linking it to foreign policy. And I think that's the other thing that we've got to do. So one of the things we're also talking about is that we will be protesting at the Labour Party conference in September on Palestine, but also we will try to link it with some of the other issues. And it seems to me that as Stop the War and the C&D, we've been campaigning for many years. We've been proved right over all these wars. Every single conflict that we said would not succeed has not succeeded. And yet they just carry on. They just carry on absolutely relentlessly. So we need to fight on all these different fronts. We need to bring the question of Palestine into the wider question about war and weapons. And we need to continue to campaign on the streets, in the trade unions, lobbying MPs. I know they regard any protest against them or any lobbyers unwarranted and violent behavior, but actually it's part of the democratic process that we tell these people that actually we're electing them and they should actually listen to what majority opinion is in this country. And we have to fight for that, not just over Palestine, but over Ukraine as well. So thanks very much, Tarina.
Thank you, Lindsay. And thanks everybody for coming this evening and staying with us throughout, especially given the problems we had earlier with somebody coming in and trying to disrupt the meeting. I'll just repeat the dates for your diary. So on this Saturday, on this Thursday, we've got the Hands Around Parliament being organised by the Palestine Coalition. On the first full day that Parliament's sitting, the idea is that everybody holds hand around Parliament to make it clear the number of people who are wanting and calling for us to stop arming Israel. So the more people that can be there, the better. The 27th of July, we've got a Unite Against Fascism protest taking place in London. The 3rd of August, as Lindsay mentioned, is the next Palestine demonstration, and then in September at the Labour Party conference. So hopefully all of those who are in this country will be able to come along to those events and join forces together and try and secure a more peaceful, safer world. If you're not already a member of Stop the War or CND, please do consider joining. And I hope to see you at one of the events coming forward. Thanks very much again, everybody, for coming this evening.